If you're in the process of learning how to sew, there's one thing that will give you comfort and peace of mind. That one thing is called hand basting. Basting is a really fast stitch to apply and just as fast to remove when no longer needed. Just like pins, it holds fabric layers and seam edges together during the machine stitching process, but unlike pins, it provides an extremely stable and secure connection. Hand basting helps you stitch perfectly aligned seams without the need for removing pins as you stitch or even risking the fabric layers kind of slipping away from one another. The beauty of hand basting is that it comes in a few different styles. Today I'll show you 4 hand basting stitches you should not and cannot live without. You'll probably use one of these techniques for most of your projects, but the other 3 will really come in handy as you take on more complex sewing tasks. These stitches will give you a lifeline when sewing unstable seams or applications that are difficult to secure using pins alone. Basting is one of the most helpful tools used in the construction process. It can be conveniently done by hand or using your sewing machine. Hand basting is applied temporarily during the sewing process. It is perhaps the best tool for sewing beginners who need extra help keeping fabric layers together and are not quite comfortable with their sewing machines. Basting is a loosely applied alternating stitch which creates spaced out stitching. The thread can be easily pulled out once no longer needed. Hand basting can be applied evenly or unevenly. Even hand basting is applied such that the stitches are shorter and exactly the same length. Both the right and wrong side of an even basting application should look exactly the same. In other words, the visible stitches and the space in between should be the same exact length. Even hand basting is used when more control and stability is needed. For example, when stitching very curved edges or working with thin, flimsy, and sheer fabrics. To apply an even basting stitch, align the seam edges or fabric layers to be basted and secure them with pins. Stitch in place a few times at the beginning of the application to secure the end of the basting. Taking short, even strokes, stitch from right to left next to the seam line, pulling the thread through every few stitches. Remove each pin as you approach it. Uneven basting is the fastest, most commonly used style in the sewing process. It is fast to apply and very easy to remove. Uneven hand basting stitches are unequal in length. As opposed to even basting, the stitch looks different on both sides. On the side the basting is applied, the stitches will appear longer while the space in between them will be shorter. If you turn the fabric over, you will notice that this is reversed. The stitches are short while the space in between is longer. Beginners in particular should hand baste all seams until they feel fully comfortable using their sewing machines and working with various types of fabric. Uneven basting is also used as a marking technique for safely transferring important stitch lines and sewing marks to the face side of the fabric. It can also be used to mark a fabric's grain lines, seam lines, pleats, and top stitch lines. To sew an uneven hand basting stitch, Secure the seam edges with pins first. Take small stitches every ½ inch or so depending on how much stability is needed to hold the fabric and seams at hand. The easiest way to baste is to take a few stitches on the needle at a time, then pull the needle and thread completely through. Remove each pin as you approach it and keep the fabric layers as stable and perfectly aligned as possible in the basting process. Baste right next to the seam line and not directly on top of it. The hand basting should not overlap with the final machine stitch. Doing so will ensure that the basting slides right out when the seam is completed. After the seam is machine stitched, use a seam ripper or a pair of scissors to pull the basting threads out. Diagonal hand basting stitch appears as diagonal floating stitches on the application face side and stacked horizontal stitches on the application's wrong side. This unique basting is applied to the surface of fabric and distributed as needed depending on fabric type and garment design. Just like all basting styles, a denser, shorter diagonal basting stitch will provide more control. A larger, sparsely distributed diagonal basting works when larger surface areas need to be temporarily secured to one another. To sew a diagonal basting stitch, pin the fabric layers together to secure if needed. Insert a horizontal stitch from right to left first, as shown. Next, insert another horizontal stitch at a distance above, parallel to the first stitch. This will create the first diagonal floating stitch. Continue applying evenly distributed horizontal stitches through all fabric layers, keeping them flat and parallel in the process. The distance between the stitches will determine how close together the final diagonal stitches will be. A longer horizontal stitch will create a longer diagonal stitch. Whether you sew or not, you have most likely encountered slip basting before. If you've ever purchased a tailored item that has pockets, you may have noticed the pocket openings being shut closed with a temporary stitch. This stitch is called slip basting and it can be easily removed when the garment is ready to use. The purpose of slip basting in this case is to maintain the structure of the pocket opening before it arrives at the end user. Slip basting is for the most part invisible on the face of the garment, as it is usually applied through a fabric fold connected to either another fold line or the fabric surface. To slip baste a seam line from its face side, fold one of the seam edges inward down its seam line and iron the fold to crease. Working on the fabric face side, place the folded edge on top of the other seam edge such that the fold aligns with the seam line. Insert pins to keep these seam lines aligned. Stitch from right to left, inserting a 1/4 inch long stitch through the flat fabric surface and then another through the folded fabric edge. Continue alternating between the fabric surface and the folded edge. The slip basting stitch should keep the seam lines together but be almost invisible on the seam's right side. When complete, flip the folded edge over such that the fabric face sides are touching and wrong side is exposed. Stitch the seam edge together as you would any regular seam.